I think architecture is a little bit different. I think when people think architects, they think of the person, or designers, they think of the people who just do the design and the building and, drawing pretty pictures. In your head from the movies, you see the guy with the rolled up drawings. That doesn't happen so much anymore, but I think the entire process of design is much, much bigger. And it starts with strategy. So that's what my specialty is in the world of architecture and design. And for lack of better language around this, we really are defining what the brief is. So I mentioned earlier, like, what are we actually solving for? Before we start drawing pictures and before we start solutioning, we need to make sure that our client has articulated what it is they're trying to achieve.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jess Fragale. You're listening to Working Capital, the real estate podcast. My special guest today is Kevin Katigbak, Strategy Director, Principal at Gensler. As the Strategy Director and Principal in Gensler's Toronto office, Kevin specializes in using placemaking to create inclusive, accessible, and sustainable environments. In his role, Kevin delivers workplace and design strategies to help his clients adapt to disruption and the changing nature of work. For more than 20 years, Kevin has worked with innovative companies to help create and implement high-performance, people-focused spaces that capitalize on new technologies and cater to the shifting needs of employees. Kevin, how's your day going?
Pretty good so far.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming on the podcast. I know that listeners are going to get a lot of value out of this. A little bit different than who we normally have on the podcast, from economists to brokers to investors. And now we're going to get a little bit of a taste for the world of real estate and workplace and design. And what I thought was topical is that, as you know, we had a conference in Toronto called the Real Capital Conference. And we talked about, I believe, a report that you did last year at Gensler and the Global Workplace Survey. That report has been done again. And by the time this is being released, we will have that report finished. So maybe for listeners, before we jump into it here, I'd like to talk a little bit about your background, how you got into real estate, the kind of specific area that you're in right now. So maybe you could give listeners just a flavor of that.
Yeah, no problem. So for clarification, I do work for Gensler, which is an architecture and design firm, and I guess my background is architecture and design. So I studied all of that, but my career got kickstarted in Europe, where a lot of strategic thinking about what goes into buildings is done. So before you put pen to paper, you do a pretty strong and comprehensive engagement on, what are we solving for? What do we actually need in this particular space? And sort of fast forward a few years after that, I moved back to Toronto and started working in strategy. So what I'm doing is kind of exactly what you said, but to a long story short is I work with clients to define what their goals are. So what do you need in your space? What should it be? What are the objectives of building a new building? How can we accomplish that? And what does that mean for design? What are the actual design elements that need to be considered to make a great space? And in this case, workplace. What are the great ingredients to a wonderful experience?
That makes sense. So in terms of the work that you do specifically in Toronto, the clients that you deal with, is there any specific niche that you deal with? For people that don't know how an architectural or design firm works, how do you get into the industry when you're first starting out? Is that something that you're working in a specific area, working with a specific client type? How does that look?
So I think Toronto is an interesting market because we have a little bit of everything. We're a financially based economy here. We're a financially based city. A lot of my clients happen to be big banks, and it's just representative of Toronto. I'd suspect that if you cut your teeth in architecture and design in Montreal, it might be slightly different. But Toronto is a really great opportunity for this industry, particularly because you can dabble in a lot of different areas and become an expert, or maybe even a generalist across different markets. So it's pretty fantastic. But early in my career, I took what I could get, and I happened to work in London. I happened to work in Toronto. So one of my specialties would be financial markets, financial industry.
Yeah, you don't fire clients earlier in your career.
No, you take what you can get and you keep on smiling, no matter what it is.
That's cool. I think that a lot of the backgrounds, especially on the brokerage side, we work with teams like yours, but we don't really understand how your teams work internally. And what goes into acquisition of clients. We know that we try to we're encouraged to cross sell, but we don't really see how the sausage is made and how your teams actually sell or acquire clients. Is there anything different from what you do when you're looking for clients to work with? Is a lot of referral work that ends up kind of coming to the doorstep?
It is quite a bit of referral work, but I think also when we look at potential new clients, we're obviously trying to match with our expertise, our areas of expertise. I think architecture is a little bit different. I think when people think of architects, they think of the person, or designers, they think of the people who just do the design and the building and, drawing pretty pictures. In your head from the movies, you see the guy with the rolled up drawings. That doesn't happen so much anymore, but I think the entire process of design is much, much bigger. And it starts with strategy. So that's what my specialty is in the world of architecture and design. And for lack of better language around this, we really are defining what the brief is. So I mentioned earlier, like, what are we actually solving for? Before we start drawing pictures and before we start solutioning, we need to make sure that our client has articulated what it is they're trying to achieve. And I think the piece around workplace is interesting because people just think it's a place to do your work and be productive. But I think the workplace has evolved into a much different sort of animal, and it must achieve a lot of different things right now. So we get our, we meet with clients in many different ways. There are a lot of referrals, but we're also pounding the pavement like all of you, doing opportunities like this to talk about what we do best. But we tend to think that you need to think from sort of a design perspective to be able to actually, achieve that building, achieve that great space.
I love that stereotypical idea of an architect. I just think of George Costanza saying, I always wanted to pretend I was an architect. So this global workplace survey, I found it fascinating because in this conference, there's, you get in your echo chambers of the same thing, repurposing buildings, flight to quality and all this stuff. And you kind of, you miss what's happening in different areas that are adjacent to where you are in a certain industry. So I found that the survey, it was interesting. And I found over the last few years, so much has changed, and I can only imagine it's affected us. I can only imagine how much it's affected your world in terms of planning on space, what type of space, the things that may have been important 5 years ago, are they still important today? So maybe you could give us a little bit of an outline as to what exactly the survey is, how long your team has been doing it, and what you're trying to accomplish with it.
Yeah, our workplace survey, our global workplace survey, actually has a pretty long history. It started almost 20 years ago. And there's a core set of questions that are trying to determine, we're trying to understand how and where people work, what's valuable to the workplace experience. But 20 years ago, the questions were maybe a little less sophisticated, and the world has changed since then. So we've been building on the set of questions. We have hundreds of thousands of responses at this point. And this 2024 survey is it's the next iteration of this. And I think there's a lot of interesting findings that probably build on some of the things from previous years, but there's also some key interesting insights that might be a bit more applicable in 2024 and beyond. So I mentioned that the intent of the survey is to understand how and where people work, but it's also to identify what makes a high performing workplace. So what are the key ingredients? What is the secret to creating an environment that is high performing? And as designers of impact, as designers who can actually impact how you feel, how you work, how you're productive, how you live, we want to measure design impact in the workplace. So what things stick, what things actually change your behavior and change what you're doing in a positive way. But also, what are things that don't quite land, that need to be workshopped a little bit more in the future?
So for those that don't know, the previous ones that have come out, I obviously from the outset I was talking about last year's. Has there anything, we can go back to a little bit more broader topics in this survey, but has there been anything that has changed since last year or the year before that has kind of jumped out at you, that was a finding that was kind of unexpected?
So I think one of the interesting things, I'm not sure if it's unexpected. We do see this anecdotally as we engage with our clients. And typically I'm meeting with the C-suite, with your leadership, to understand, what are your challenges? Um, Over the last 3-4 years since the pandemic, certainly, the big question was, what is the purpose of the office? Now that we know we can do whatever we want to do remotely, what's actually bringing us in? What's the draw to come into the office? And that has been shifting slightly year to year. So early pandemic 2021, I believe the top reason globally to come into the office was to meet with my team. So think about the things that you weren't able to do during the pandemic. And Canada was on a pretty stringent lockdown. So we wanted to meet with our team. 2022, 23, so that was a big aggregate of data. The key finding there, the key reason, the purpose of the office in that time was to focus on work. So, and I want to be clear, that's not about doing focus work. That's actually being able to go to a place that isn't my kitchen table, that doesn't have roommates or children or pets running around, but it's a place dedicated and designed to make me productive, to make me work with my teams in the most effective way. And I think one of the biggest things that we see for this new piece of research, the primary reasons comes to the office, and you may be synonymous with the purpose of the office. People want to come in to socialize. So I mean, when you think about that, when you think about people really wanting to come into to socialize, you start to ask questions. What's driving the need to socialize all of a sudden? It's always been in the top five. Socialization is important. It's important to culture. It's important to liking what you do day to day. But for it to show up in the top spot is, pretty remarkable from my perspective.
It's it's just kind of thinking about this now, but it reminds me a little bit about high school. When you're at that age, you don't want to go for any of the academics. I mean, vaguely, you don't want to go for any of the academics, but
Totally.
the idea of staying home for an extended period of time and not seeing your friends and not having that component in there is this like kind of idea. There is this push and pull where you go into the office, it is work, but having it taken away for so long, I think genuinely a lot of people miss that. And I think and I'm sure you've seen this, I think the result of that isn't necessarily get into the office, 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, but we're seeing a lot more of 3 days a week, 4 days a week. So why don't you, for the purpose of listeners with this survey, maybe you could give us a little bit of the parameters of how the methodology, how it's done, a little bit about who's actually putting the information in here, and where are you getting this data from? Is it global? Is it North American?
Yeah, I'll give you a bit of a background. We'll do a fact check afterwards. You might have to do a correction corner in the future. But this particular survey is for 16,000. So it's a survey. It goes global.
Yep.
I believe we have 15 countries tied into this. Every country that has a Gensler office will participate in the survey. I do want to be stress that we've got a third party we're not sort of getting involved with the data collection, but the survey goes out. It gets this particular survey has crosses 10 different industries. We have a few stipulations around it. We don't want organizations of less than 100 people, so you have a good data set. We're trying to be as equitable in terms of the demographics, in terms of the data that we're collecting as well. What else is there to say about this? I think critical to this is we're surveying people who have returned to the office in a regular way. So I want to be clear that we're not asking people who have decided to work remotely forever. We're trying to understand the impacts of the built environment. So if you're not coming in, your perspective will be very different. If you do come in one day, it's not for what everyone else is coming in. So we should make it clear that the people that are responding to this survey, the 16,000 people, are people who have returned in a regular way. So, 1 day a week, but regularly 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, that sort of thing.
So on that global front, are there trends that you're seeing in different geographies? Are they doing different things in European countries as opposed to Asian countries, as opposed to North American? Does anything jump out from a geographical perspective?
Yeah, there is some geography differences. I think there might even be some political influences in some of these things, because like when I look at where people are working is actually a pretty good indicator. In Canada, 25% of the people who go into the office regularly are working from home. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's actually the second highest of the different countries that we took information from. So Canada's second highest, whereas the US is not quite that high. And I think to my earlier comment, Canada had a very strict lockdown. We also had a very slow out of the pandemic, whereas some other countries maybe accelerated that better than we did. So they were back in the office in a regular way in 2022 when we had our last lockdown in 2022. So I still believe that we're seeing some of the residual effects of how the pandemic was actually handled, and some of that is starting to show up in the data. So there are some differences. We have clients, Gensler's Global. Anecdotally, I've got a few projects that are happening in Asia, in Europe here, and the return to office seems to be very different. So in Hong Kong, for instance, there's a lot more people going in every single day, and there's very different reasons as to why that happens. They have smaller apartments. There's great air conditioning in the office. Those sorts of things. Canada is kind of, we have long commutes, we have terrible commutes, public transport's not the best, driving is expensive, parking is expensive, we have terrible weather. There's lots of reasons that are going to impact how often you're coming into the city. Not even into the office, but like how often you're actually trudging through to your commute to get to where you need to go.
So one thing that I find, it's good that I have an expert here, because one thing that I find fascinating is that we use all these different metrics in different cities for how many people are returning to office: cell phone data, people coming in to the cities, parking revenue. One interesting piece of anecdata was one of the major landlords in Toronto was telling me that their parking has just surpassed their pre-pandemic revenue. And that got me thinking about a few things. One, that it's true that when I go into the office, the studies that we see with return to office cell phone data, we see 70, 60, 70% maximum on the highest volume day. But on other days, I can't get parking at, if I come to the office after 8 a.m., I'm going to P2. So what's happening there? Is there any insight as to people coming in and then certain days, or just coming to the city in general and not going into the office? Have you been able to parse any of that kind of data?
It's wild. Actually, I was just having a conversation earlier that you can come into the city on a Tuesday and try to walk into one of the restaurants at the financial district, and you're on a waiting list.
Yeah.
On a Tuesday or on a Monday, even. This happens to me all the time. And I think one of the things that we're starting to see is that people are willing to make the commute. They're not necessarily commuting to the office. So you'll put up with traffic. You'll put up with all the inconveniences of coming downtown if you're going to a game, if you're going to a museum, if you're going to see friends for a drink. Um, so it's interesting how important the neighborhood amenities are to that return to office. It's not just the office building. And I think we can't blame the office building all the time to say that, it doesn't have the best whatever. There's other reasons why people are coming to the office, and it's coming downtown, and it's not necessarily what they're finding in the office. It's all those other life things.
Yeah, I would like to see a study that actually shows the monthly or month to month parking revenue, because I think
Yeah.
that is more relevant. If somebody's putting down $500 or $400 a month, that you need 2 months to break the contract with a major building in the city. You're not just going down for dinner, right? You're obviously parking there at least a couple days a week.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to actually see that. I want to move over to related here, but hybrid working.
Yeah.
That word means so much to so many different people, to the point where it kind of means nothing to anyone at a certain point.
Yeah.
When I think of hybrid work, I think, like most people do, some schedule that is not the 5 day a week schedule, some basically ability to come in 3 or 4 days a week, potentially work from home for a couple days a week. When you're dealing with clients, what's that conversation like? And are you seeing that it's almost an assumption that there's some sort of hybrid, or are there still companies taking a more staunch view as to when they have their employees in?
Yeah, hybrid's a tough one because it is everything under the sun. So I think at the highest level, it is a condition where part of your employee population will be working virtually at any given time, and part of them will be in the office. So the outcome is you're going to have hybrid meetings or hybrid, collaboration, that sort of thing. But we're still in this interesting time where we're really trying to define what that means to a fine point, and I think that's a little bit challenging because it locks you into a situation. So we're seeing hybrid across. Would I say 1 day a week is hybrid? Maybe not. That feels like it's remote first. 4 to 5 days a week, is that hybrid? That sounds like it's full time back in the office. If I look at our data, actually pre-pandemic, when there was no such thing as hybrid, and it hadn't touched the tongues of anybody. People were already coming in less than 4 days a week. The highest performing organizations on average would be coming into the office 3.5, 4 days a week. So that already tells me there's a lot of flexibility pre-pandemic for the situation for hybrid. But I still think that we're looking at organizations trying to define it and create solutions that are relevant to what they're trying to achieve. And I think through that experiment, through that process, they start to become a little bit more lenient in their rules and their categories around this, because it is a very difficult. We're not talking about flexibility yearly. We're talking about flexibility daily, hourly, weekly, monthly. In Canada, I talked about the seasons. Your utilization, winter and summer, will be different than fall and spring. If I look at utilization in Calgary, I did a lot of work out in Calgary, and on a Friday, you wouldn't see a single person at 3 because they were all out to enjoy Calgary, to enjoy the surrounding parts of the city. That's a very different schedule than someone in Montreal or Toronto, and it's just the nature of how flexibility works. You're flexible, you're not flexible.
Yeah. So in terms of the how that kind of works out in terms of the productivity piece, how do you go about measuring productivity if a company is saying, especially at the beginning of this, where they're saying, how is this switch to a potential hybrid model? How are we measuring the productivity of our employees? I think some of the fear of going to the ability to work at home was, some companies would basically have policies with laptops, certain types of monitoring work that you're doing, and then it started to feel like you're working for Big Brother. How have you navigated those types of questions with clients of yours?
Yeah, it always comes back to productivity, and obviously productivity is different organization to organization. But I try to encourage thinking about what are the metrics of success beyond productivity. So productivity is going to be a part of that, but maybe part of your organization's performance is the culture. It's your dedication to the organization, to the job, to your team. I think looking at how hybrid impacts those separate metrics is also important to understanding how effective you're being at your job. But productivity has always been a tricky question. It's like we try to avoid it, just because unless it's you're a bean counter, you're going through very specific things, like you have a product at the end of the day, and the number of products you've created is tied directly to productivity. It's a little bit tougher. I've seen some interesting ways of, have we reduced emails? Have we increased meeting with different teams? And, everyone likes to say breaking down silos, but there's ways to measure that. That could also be falling under productivity.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. In terms of the studies that you do, or the survey, do you track at all um, individuals that have decided to leave organizations that they were with because of certain policies that they've instituted, whether that's in the office 4 days a week or mandatory coming in of X days a week?
So we don't track that. We don't track, how many people have left because they suddenly had to return to the office more than they wanted to. But part of this study is actually comparing high performing offices and the likelihood you'll stay there for the next year, which is literally a question that we asked. And I won't go into all the details of how we sort of sectioned off people who fall into the category of high performing workplaces versus low performing workplaces. But people in high performing workplaces, 100% of those respondents said they were going to stay at their organization, which demonstrates a little bit more commitment and trust perhaps to that organization for the next year, which we find astonishing, because one, we've never had 100% of any respondents agree on anything. And for it to be that high performing organizations actually impact your commitment to the organization is a fascinating one for us. And I think it does merit a bit more digging in to understand what areas, again, are the most impactful.
So that piece there, if you have places that we're kind of calling high performance, if you go to, say, back 5 years, there were certain areas, I'm sure in other cities as well, but we'll use Toronto because I know it, that the West End is a cool area to be. A lot of tech companies, brick and beam style, exposed brick buildings. There's a lot of the appeal for that. Now, transit for those areas, it was not as good, obviously, as being in the financial core, but there was this almost distaste for corporate suits and traditional buildings, and not really a lot of motivation for those type of landlords to be exposing ceilings at that time, exposing floors, polished concrete, that kind of thing. It's kind of flipped on its head now. We've had clients of ours that, even though they like the characteristics of those buildings, amenities, transit have kind of risen to the top of the list, even more so than with real estate that you'd assume. Have you seen that trend as well? And what are these other buildings or neighborhoods? What do they have to do to kind of win back some of that clientele or tenants?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting observation. Like I think about the West End, I think about Liberty Village and the types of tenants it sort of attracts. And I think you're right. There's the sort of anti-corporate, but the return to office and the desire to come to the office is so impacted by the commute in this city, anyways. That is such a massive reason to not want to come to the office. Like if you think about getting on the King streetcar, you suddenly, I can work from home today. Or you're going to start work at 6 a.m. and come home at 3 p.m. because you're going to skip most of the traffic, hopefully. But I think what our research has taught us, and this could be a chicken or an egg, but the correlative study tells us that um, neighborhoods with really fantastic amenities, neighborhoods that kind of provide everything, attract really fantastic buildings, and vice versa. You start to see great amenities, different amenities, gyms, daycare, wellness, groceries. You're not just bars and restaurants, being supportive of that office ecosystem. And we keep on saying that, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but there is your office in the walls that you pay rent, what you can design, what you can build for yourself. There's the building that office sits in, and there's a neighborhood that building sits in, and they're all working together. They're all creating a better experience. And it's the reason why, if you look in the suburbs, you might have a campus that has a full service cafeteria. Well, there's no other place to eat out there, so you need to up your services. Whereas you look downtown, you don't need to build all of these amenities because they're a stone's throw away. And those two things really have a tight correlation. Really fantastic real estate and really fantastic neighborhoods.
What are the top amenities that you've seen that are pretty much non-negotiables for certain organizations? I'm sure at a certain size of organization, there's basically a list that there's the nice
Yeah.
to haves and there's the we need to have.
So I think there's two that I'm seeing, and they're more informal versions of a meeting room and a focus space. So I'm talking about the office that you're paying for. So I have 100,000 square feet, and I need to fit it out for my organization. And maybe I'll start with the idea of a work cafe. Um, we're seeing it everywhere. It's a non-negotiable. It shows up in every building that we see that we design or others design, and it is a large cafeteria that has food and beverage, maybe, but it has AV equipment embedded. It has comfortable furniture embedded. It can be used for your meal times to have lunch or breakfast or dinner, but could be used as a natural gathering place. It's often much larger because it becomes that natural gathering place for the entire organization, and it's almost a place you're guaranteed to bump into someone you don't typically guarantee. You're guaranteed to sit to run into. So it is very much an informal type of a space, but has a function to it. The other side is a work library. So I mentioned this is kind of an informal version of a focus space of an office or a desk, but it's really a space that might be closed off. It's for group work, but individual group work. And what I mean by that is there's policies. You got to be quiet in this. You got to turn off your phone. No video calls. It's for heads down work. And in a world that's unassigned, or in a world that you might not have your office like you did before, it is a oasis where you can get your work done. If I'm here, it's a signal to other people I'm trying to get work done, and it's actually quiet and it has the things I need and it's comfortable. So I'd say those two amenities are things that are table stakes at this point. 10 years ago, a regular cafe was fine, a library was unusual.
What did you call that library? Is it just a library office, or is there a name for that?
It's like a library. So we just call it a library because it
Yeah.
operates exactly like a library. There's not really closed areas in it. It might be a harvest table. It might be some those weird pods that are more furniture than built space.
Mhm.
But the difference here, it's the behavior expectation in that space. Like you don't come here to talk to people. You come here to do the opposite. And so it becomes a very effective place where you're almost guaranteed a place to do heads down work without interruption.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I've never heard it described like that, but I feel like that's partially why so many of the areas, even I'm just picturing in my office, that you have almost that, but it's in an open area. So you don't really, you don't, there's like an assumption when you sit there that anybody could talk to you at any time. But the idea of having a cornered off area where it's, the assumption is that you're trying to do heads down work, so you don't have to politely tell somebody, hey, I'm working on something. That seems like it would be actually really useful in any of the offices that we work with.
Absolutely. I think it's what everyone's asking for. And I think, early in the pandemic, the assumption was, let's build a lot more collaborative space because focus work will happen at home. And in many ways that's come to fruition. You do as much of your heads down work at home. But when you come into the office, you make sure it's worth coming into the office. So you don't come in for 1 hour for one meeting. You come in for an hour for that meeting, and then you might stick around. So in every reality, you are going to go into collaborate and focus. So we need to think about a balanced office environment that provides environments, space types that support both quiet heads down work and collaborative socialization.
You hear a lot of larger landlords talking about additional amenities, ancillary services, daycares, gyms. How important is that? Or is that just, we're at a critical mass where the assumption is a larger landlord will have that in that type of building?
So and it's a very good question. And I think if you asked me this 5 years ago, I'd have a very different answer. But we are starting to see landlords look at providing above and beyond what was typically, understood. And you asked about the table stakes thing. I'll say that every single client I've had in the last pandemic years anyway, when they're looking for a different location or a potential move, it's, where's the closest gym? Does the building provide a gym? Is there a conference area that we could, so we don't have to build our own conference area? Is there something that we could use that's already in the building? So tenants are really looking for the building to leverage. So build less in their space and leverage the building on some of those amenities. But again, it's different. I'd suggest amenities in Liberty Village would be different than the financial district, what people are asking for. But the growth in people looking to even reposition their lobbies is fascinating because you're competing against brand new buildings. How can we up the game and create a really fantastic experience?
Yeah, and I think there's so much to be said for a lot of these amenities. We go into a whole nother conversation about what's being offered. We're coming up on the time here, Kevin. For just to wrap up here, is there anything else from the survey that you did that you think listeners would find value in? Was there anything that kind of popped out that, again, like you were just saying, something 5 years ago that you would have said one way, where you've kind of had your opinion changed as a result?
So yeah, I think the whole conversation around hybrid, what does hybrid mean? I think the subtext to that question has always been, how do I get my people to come to the office? What is utilization like? If I'm in 3 days a week, how much space do I need? The future, I think, is going to be measured in performance, not utilization, not attendance, and not presence. So when people do come in, are they being effective? Do they feel like they're in a supported environment where they can get their job done? They can have their life done. They can bond and connect with their colleagues. I think that is really one of the top metrics we're looking at in the future. And I think keep on looking at utilization, but it shouldn't be the driver in the decisions that you make moving forward.
Yeah, it's almost how efficient can we be with the limited amount of time that we're in the office. For
Exactly.
those that would just want some more information or reach out to yourself or Gensler, where could we send them? We can put a couple links in the show notes.
Yeah, I mean, you can reach out right to our company, Gensler.com. And there's, the Toronto office, but we have offices. I know we're 7,000 people at this point, so we have offices all over the place. You can reach out to the Toronto office and to a direct line. We'll add the links in, but you can reach out to myself, Kevin Katigback, or, someone will help you.
My guest today has been Kevin Katigback. Kevin, thanks for being part of Working Capital.
My pleasure.